So thanks for being here, despite all the overwhelming presentations you already digested. So what I'm presenting here is basically the merger of two papers, so I will be making some leaps, and if there are questions, please ask me afterwards. This comes really out of my wider discomfort or sometimes disquieting reception of discourses on data colonialism, which has gained traction over the past 4 years in the critique of data power. The most recent example, and I'm sure you've seen the flyers, was presented by Nick Couldry and Ulysses Meyers, the book The Cost of Connection, in which they offer a very interesting critique of the political economy of data relations, formulating it really as a reification and expansion of historical modes of colonial dispossession in contemporary data regimes. But in line with most of the critiques of data colonialism, Couldry and Meyers focus above all on the extractive logic of data capitalism, on the ways in which datafication appropriates and exploits social activity and relations for the sake of value creation, with the effect that even the most mundane aspects of everyday life are rendered into the service of capital. And while these critiques have certainly offered some important continuity and highlighted some important continuities in the entanglement of datafication, dispossession, and enclosure, I think we need to look beyond the narrow frame of political economy when we are trying to understand data power and its particular forms of violence. In my own work, this means examining the relationship between data and value through the wider lens of knowledge ontologies. And here I'm starting with a question where we really should situate best data within ontologies of the social, and how we can unpack many of the unspoken assumptions we make when we think the relationship between data, subjects, and worlds in our critiques. At the same time, I think it's also important to disrupt this unspoken universality that is built in the idea of data colonialism as the planetary new social order suggested by Couldry and Meyers, and to argue for a more locally specific and historically situated analysis of datafication, to acknowledge the many nuances and variations in the way datafication affects people and places, but also how it produces and sustains very differential hierarchies of life and social existence across the planet today. In other words, what I'm arguing for is a better distinction between the beneficiaries of historical forms of colonialism and those on its receiving end. So what I'm presenting here today is one attempt to do that by way of intersectional analysis of data relations in the specific context of irregular migration in the Mediterranean Sea. And my main argument here is really that the oppressive force of data relations is not reducible to logics of extraction, exploitation, and enclosure for the sake of profit. They rather need to be understood as productive materializations of power relations, capable of producing new underclasses of datafied subjects, what I call digital subalterns, that are kept outside the political and symbolic order, and whose inaudibility is a direct result of their ambivalent standing within registers of security, market, and state. Now, as I'm sure you know, intersectional analysis is interested in how apparently value-free bureaucratic processes, such as counting, mapping, and data extraction, redistribute violence unevenly across populations, amplifying possible harms for those who are already targeted on multiple levels at once. Relayed back to the context here, this involves interrogating how the targeted exclusions and power asymmetries that hold refugees in a persistent state of legal ambivalence and ontological insecurity, how they are amplified, reformulated, and reproduced by digital infrastructures, as they diffract unifying signifiers such as race, class, gender, age, or ethnicity across socio-technical, legal, and political domains. In the specific context of irregular migration, this means looking not just at the ways, looking not just at the excess of data collected on migrants by way of biometric screening and tracking devices, but also to consider the particular forms of violence that occur by the refusal to datafy certain bodies, when certain kinds of bodies are simply left outside the big data frame. The Mediterranean is currently one of the most policed seascapes in the world, and arguably one of the best mapped crises in the history of humanitarianism. The main agencies involved here include the border security agency Frontex, but also various civil society activists such as Médecins Sans Frontières, Sea-Watch, Alarm Phone, Watch the Map, all of whom use automated ship tracking technologies, satellite phones, surveillance drones, but also satellite images to monitor the irregular trafficking of migrants, but also shipwrecks and migrant fatalities. One of the striking paradoxes in this scenario is that despite this excessive mapping and surveillance activities, there's little reliable information available on dead and missing migrants. Now, it's important to note here that Frontex, the leading borders security agency, doesn't keep a track record of how many die or disappear on their way to Europe. It has in fact no interest in dead and missing migrants, but focuses mainly on the living, those who continue to pose an acute threat to its bordering regime. For civil society activists, on the other hand, counting the dead has become a key strategy to expose the violence of securitization in the Mediterranean and to hold European states to account. They keep a daily record of all reported death, compiling them into various lists and maps based on interviews with survivors, media reports, but also based on information from medical examiners, which they then use for public demonstrations and press campaigns. But they are still, the numbers they come up with not only diverge radically, but they are based on estimates and guesses. Only in some specific cases that produce a high death toll, like the cases in Lampedusa in 2013 and 16, that cost more than 700 dead people. Groups like forensic oceanography conduct very sophisticated forensic investigations of ship movements, calculating in minute detail the movement of NATO and Frontex ships to produce tangible evidences how border security invades their international obligations to assist struggling migrants at sea. Now, the maps coming out of these investigative reports were at least partially successful. They managed to disrupt the wall of silence produced around the human cost of border policing, forcing European states to openly acknowledge their responsibility and implication in migrant death. But they also established dead migrant bodies as a key battleground between activists and border security agencies. Now, activists take great pride in the subversive use of data infrastructures, describing it as a form of epistemic disobedience, capable of turning the surveillance gaze of the state against itself. And yet, without doubting the sincerity of these political ambitions, the death maps produced, and you see one in the back here, which is an example of one of those forensics investigations exposing the avoidance of Frontex to assist migrants at sea. These death maps, nonetheless, in their critique of the state, ended up simply mirroring the objectifying gaze of the state and its security apparatus, insofar as they are reading the human cost of irregular border crossings from the same disembodied view of nowhere as Frontex and local coast guards, leaving the migrants' own partial perspectives invisible and partially foreclosed. What's more, by reading migrant deaths primarily on the basis of their last known geolocation, the activists, just like Frontex, spatialize death in a way that merely reifies the territoriality of the current geopolitical order, because they're reading the embodied substance of the dead and missing migrant solely in relation to the state and the expansive geography of the border, ignoring their relational entanglement with surviving families and relatives. So what is lost on the way, in my argument, is the potential to rewrite the map from the viewpoint of the dead and missing migrant body itself, not as a fixed or bounded essence, but as a multiplicity, as scattered in all its scattered and diffracted present, stretched across various spatial, temporal, and affective registers and locales. There are many ways to produce such a diffractive reading. The most sophisticated one we can see regularly when commercial shipping accidents occur. There, you see states, with the help of foreign governments, deploy high-end state-of-the-art equipment to retrieve bodies from the sea and make them available for later identification and reunification with their families. Yet access to such state-of-the-art technology is reserved for national citizens, whose rights to be identified is clearly and unambiguously expressed in international law. For irregular migrants, the situation is rather different. It's simply not clear on whom the responsibility to retrieve corpses fall, in particular when they are drowning in international waters. But there are other less expensive means. It has been tested that once you combine weather data with patterns of ocean tides, you can computate and predict where and when bodies will resurface. So in order to collect them and make them available for forensic investigation and identification, so that they can be reunified with family members searching for their relatives and friends. Other examples include local initiatives by individual police officers in Sicily, for instance, who set up Facebook pages, very informal means, to provide an access point for relatives searching for missing persons and to allow to identify found bodies on the basis of snapshot photographs. These direct involvements of family and relatives has been ignored, not just by activists, but also by states, by European states, who are very reluctant to conduct even the most forensic, basic forensic investigations of migrant bodies washing up on their shores. Only a fraction of the corpses that are found ever receive a proper autopsy or are examined to take DNA samples that would allow for their identification and reunification with the families. This makes it, of course, extremely difficult for those searching for missing family members, leaving them not only in distress and uncertainty, but it has huge effects on women, for example, but also for children. Without a death certificate, without knowing and having a real proof that your family member has died, as a woman you lose your inheritance rights, maybe even the right to take care of your children, or found children who have relatives in Sweden, in Germany, somewhere, cannot be reunified with them because the death of the parent is actually not certified and there's no formal documentation of this. Now, for me, there are two main conclusions to be drawn from this. The ever more pervasive datafication of irregular migration has produced a striking imbalance between the level of detail and amount of data collected for the purpose of securitization and the quality and depth of knowledge generated through a careful examination of individual migrant bodies above and below sea grounds. This discrepancy is not only disintegrates the data missing into a scattered assemblage of data fragments spread across legal, political, and administrative registers, it has left the data missing migrants by and large unreadable and unrecognizable, both as historical subjects, but also as subjects of legal and moral protection and care. Simon Brown, in reference to Fanon, has described the dehumanizing effects of these mapping and tracking technologies as a form of digital epidermalization. She draws on Fanon's notion of epidermalization here, which describes the way certain kinds of bodies are cast outside the order of normalcy on the basis of calculations of the textures of their skin. The selective reading of dead and missing migrants, I suggest, is indeed, and the refusal to identify them, can be understood as another variant of such an ontological displacement qua digital epidermalization, only in the reverse direction. Here, it's the refusal to computate the experiential surface of the skin that becomes the site of dehumanization, alienation, and of denial of the migrant subjectivity. It conjures up an arithmetic of skin in which certain deaths simply no longer register or are rendered outside of existence and therefore outside of the spectrum of humanity as such. The structural abandonment of drowned corpses in this sense is not a systematic glitch, nor is it reducible to the inefficiency or lack of funds. It rather reveals new phases of racialization and erasure that are particular to contemporary data regimes. It has locked dead and missing migrants in an ambivalent state of absent presences that powerfully evokes Spivak's notion of the subaltern as the one placed outside the symbolic order, defined above all by its inability to speak on its own terms. Subalternity, it's worth remembering, is not an incapacity or impossibility to speak. It refers to a failure of speech, to the inability to register one's voice within a surplus of reason that has always already laid out the terms and conditions of speech in advance. Relayed back to the specific context of digital speech, by way of mapping or datafication, this denial of enunciation is not reducible to discourse or targeted exclusions. They rather powerfully demonstrate, in my view, how datafication operates through the full spectrum of materiality that constitute the facticity of the body, starting with its socio-economic disposition, its gender, environment, all the way down to its physical substance. And it allows for the flexible configuration of subjectivities into more or less human forms. And I think I end it here and leave it up for you to ask questions afterwards.